Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Mike Rugel from the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, where we tell the story of Jews in the American military from the Revolution up to the current day. It's a pleasure to be here with Dr. Beverley Eddy to give us a talk from Buchenwald to Camp Ritchie and back. We present this as part of our Alan S. Brown Scholar Series. Alan S. Brown proudly served his country for 23 years as a U.S. naval officer and was a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War. In memory of his dedication to community and education, we present talks from renowned scholars and authors working in the field of American Jewish military history. Beverley Eddy's new book is Ritchie Boy Secrets: How a Force of Immigrants and Refugees Helped Win World War II. So ever since the documentary film about the Ritchie Boys made by Christian Bauer came out some 15 years ago or so, I should have checked the date, but it's around then, the men that trained at Camp Ritchie has been one of the topics that our museum visitors ask most frequently about. And it's almost always presented as the story of German Jewish refugees who became American soldiers and were trained at Camp Ritchie and returned to Europe as POW interrogators. And they're great stories. And that's a big, important part of the story. But the whole story of Camp Ritchie is much broader and includes all kinds of people. I want to read a quote from the book from a Private George Bailey, who later became a journalist focusing on Germany. He wrote about Camp Ritchie. There were barracks housing Russians, Greeks, French, Italians, Spanish, Indians, American and Hindu, Icelanders, Laplanders, Mexicans, Albanians, Ruthenians, Macedonians, Slovenians, Wends, Hungarians, Welsh, Algerians, Syrians, Montenegrins, Ceylonese, Eskimos, Cossacks, Mongolian, and Basques, to name a few. So that's just a hint at how broad the men and women at Camp Ritchie were. About a year and a half ago, we had Bernie Luberin give a very interesting, excellent talk on the Ritchie Boys. And when asked what to read, Bernie would say, you know, there really wasn't a comprehensive history out there yet, but wait, Beverley Eddy's book is coming. So I was really excited when it was finally published a couple months ago. And it's great to see things like the chapter on the WACs, the Women's Army Corps who were at Camp Ritchie. There's a lot more in the Pacific than had been previously covered. So a lot of fascinating stuff that really has not been covered much before. We decided today to focus on Ritchie Boys' experiences connected to internment camps, different types of camps, and we'll hear some really powerful stories. We will get to questions at the end, and I'm going to ask people to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The chat is open as well. But and you feel free to use that to communicate. But in terms of getting your questions answered by Dr. Eddy, please use the Q&A function, and we will get to that at the end. Beverley Driver Eddy is Professor Emerita of German at Dickinson College with 7 books to her credit, including Camp Sharp's Psycho Boys, which is very much related to the Ritchie Boys project. And I'm also very intrigued by this one, a translation of a 15th century text on Dracula. So we'll have to maybe find out more about that some other time. She's presented and lectured widely on the Ritchie Boys, including at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, and she joins us from her home in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, not too far from the site of Camp Ritchie. So Dr. Eddy, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mike. It seems strange that a teacher of literature and language would get interested in the Ritchie Boys, but I got into it because I was doing research for a book on the German novelist Klaus Mann, and I learned that he'd trained there. And I soon learned that he was not the only well-known German writer to go through training at Camp Ritchie. Novelists Hans Habe and Stefan Heim also trained at Ritchie, and both wrote about the camp in their memoirs. The more I got into my research on these men, the more fascinated I became. Usually, Army camps train their men to function as cogs in a well-oiled machine. But the Ritchie Boys were trained to act independently and to think creatively. And the training seemed to work, as I found out when I studied how the Ritchie Boys performed in the field. But I also got a number of surprises. It was a surprise to me that Ritchie Boys were sent to the war in the Pacific, as well as North Africa and Europe, that they fought and died on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, that they collected intelligence in New Guinea and the Philippines, and they trained, they went into Burma and Indochina to work with the natives there and to arm them and teach them how to use weapons. So that isn't a big aspect of Ritchie that I won't mention today. Mike has also talked about how Ritchie was a hodgepodge of languages and nationalities. Still, the percentage of German and Austrian Ritchie boys stands at slightly over 20%, and this is far above the percentages of the other foreign-born nationalities. And we must not forget that 60% of the Ritchie boys were American-born, many to immigrant parents. And in an overlap of German-born and American-born Ritchie boys, slightly over 25% of the men that we know of were Jews. I grew up after the war, and it was only recently that I began to suspect that some of my German teachers may have been Ritchie boys. And I did learn, but only after his death, that Joe Kellinger, one of my colleagues in the German department at Dickinson College, had been a Ritchie boy as well. In fact, I was constantly being surprised as I researched the camp, and today's talk arose from one of those surprises. Can you show the first slide, Mike? There we go. This surprise was the fact that some of the Ritchie boys had actually been imprisoned in the earliest German concentration camps, even before they were allowed to leave Germany and come to the United States. These camps had originally been built to house political prisoners and resistance fighters. Dachau in 1933, Sachsenhausen in 1936, and Buchenwald in 1937. But right after the pogroms against German Jews began in the night from November 9th to 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up from their homes, and most of these were transported to these camps, where their imprisonments generally ran from several weeks to several months. When the men who'd been imprisoned in the German concentration camps arrived for training at Camp Ritchie, then they could give their fellow students firsthand accounts about the treatment that prisoners received there. Next slide. So let me start with Buchenwald. I found 6 Ritchie boys so far who were imprisoned here in 1938. Today, I will focus on Ernst Kramer, who grew up in Augsburg, Germany, and was 15 when Hitler came to power. Kramer had hoped to become a teacher, but family finances forced him to drop out of school and do farm work. He was one of the 10,000 Jewish men rounded up in the morning of November 10th and transported to Buchenwald, a camp located just 5 miles from Weimar, the cultural center of Germany. The Nazis had not yet come up with the final solution of the extermination camps. Instead, the plan was to let Jewish men, 18 years old and older, experience the horrors of the work camps, and through this to get them to move to another country. They would be released as soon as their families could submit documents demonstrating that the prisoners could, in fact, leave the country within 6 months of their release. But this was extremely difficult, since by then most countries had severely reduced their immigration quotas. In Buchenwald, the men were exposed to all the discomfort the camp could offer. The men were given summer clothing for winter weather, and they had to march out and form ordered lines for roll call at 5 in the morning and again at 6 in the evening. If there was a miscount or someone was missing, they had to remain standing in formation until the correct number was reached. The slightest infraction was punished in deliberately arbitrary fashion, most often with a sharp blow to one's back with a rifle butt or by being punched to the ground and kicked. But the punishment prisoners feared most was having one's hands tied behind the back and being hoisted until only one's toes strafed the ground. Kramer remained in this camp for 6 weeks, He was relatively lucky. America was looking for people trained in agriculture, and Kramer had worked in farming. He passed a test the Americans gave to all Germans claiming expertise in this field and received a preferential visa, not as a refugee, but as a foreigner with something to contribute to America. He was 20 when he was released from Buchenwald and 21 when he came to the States. His family was not so fortunate. Only as the war was ending did Kramer learn that his parents and brother had all been deported and murdered. When America entered the war, Kramer enlisted in the Army and was hand-selected for Ritchie's special training program in psychological warfare. There, he acquired the journalistic skills that would make him adept at producing propaganda materials in France and Germany, and that would later help determine his future. Next slide. When Kramer left Buchenwald, he was, as all Jews in those camps were, given a temporary German passport. I'm showing it since it's typical for passports given to those men who were imprisoned in concentration camps and then given only a brief period in which to leave the country. The photo, as you can see, shows Kramer with a shaved head, wearing a necktie and an oversized, ill-fitting coat lent to him for the occasion. The first page of the passport has a large red J for Jew. Following a page giving a physical description of him, page 4 in the lower left shows that Kramer's passport was issued on December 22nd, 1938, but was only valid for a period of slightly over 4 months and would expire on April 30th, 1939. On the next page, we see that the validity of the passport has been lengthened to December 21st, 1939. And on the last page, we see the American immigration visa dated July 21st, 1939. Next slide. I have found only 3 Ritchie boys so far who were imprisoned in Dachau. Martin Selling was one of the 11,000 Jewish men imprisoned there. He grew up in a small Bavarian village where he had an unhappy childhood. His father died when he was 3, and when he was 10, his mother developed Parkinson's disease, and he had to take over much of her care. She died in 1936 when he was 18. Then, in the early morning of November 10th, 1938, Selling was seized by the Gestapo and, for some inexplicable reason, housed for 6 weeks in the Nuremberg prison before being transferred into Dachau. As the first of the German concentration camps, Dachau set the standards for those that followed. Although it was December, Selling was issued only a summer prison uniform, and for the first 2 weeks there, had only sandals to wear. He said that for the Dachau inmates, January 23rd, 1939 was a date as terrible as that of the night of broken glass. On that day, a prisoner escaped from the camp, and all the prisoners were forced to stand at attention on the parade grounds from 6 in the evening until midnight. In the morning, the parade ground was strewn with the bodies of men who had frozen to death. Selling was released from the camp 4 days later with open frostbite sores that the camp medics tried to cover up with facial cream and talcum powder. He was 20 years old. He was on a waiting list for a visa to the United States, but until this became a reality, he was allowed to go to England and live there in a refugee camp in Kent. He sailed to America a year later. Next slide. Unlike Ernst Kramer, who was trained in psychological warfare, Martin Selling's training at Camp Ritchie focused on the interrogation of German prisoners of war. He was assigned to the 35th Infantry Division, where he gathered tactical intelligence from prisoners immediately upon their capture at the front. He said that his personal history gave him an edge when he interviewed prisoners. Whenever one of them asked him where he learned to speak such good German, he said, "In Germany and in Dachau, I learned the art of interrogation." Next slide. The Sachsenhausen concentration camp had been set up about 50 miles north of Berlin. 6,000 Jews were brought here in the November 1938 arrests. Hans Herzberg was one of these. He grew up in Hanover, where his father had been a pediatrician until the Nazis revoked the licenses of all Jewish doctors. Herzberg was forced out of school without graduating and was working at a bell foundry in Dortmund when he was arrested and sent to Sachsenhausen. There, the prisoners were dressed in leftover uniforms from World War I. His life in the camp consisted of running back and forth for 10 hours a day, carrying heaps of sand in the long coattails of his uniform and emptying it in a different place each day. The weather was so cold that he urinated on his hands to prevent infection. He was released after 5 days in the camp because he had already applied for a visa to the United States, but he did not receive one for another 2 years. He returned to his parents' home in Hanover, where he was one of the few Ritchie boys to witness the first big bombing raids on German cities. In February 1941, 220 British planes bombed Hanover. 6 months later, an American visa in hand, Herzberg left for the United States. He was one of the very last Jews allowed to leave the country and had to petition to do so. He was 22 years old. His parents and his younger brother were not so lucky. They were sent to the East and executed. Herzberg would not learn of this until the end of the war, when he was working as an interrogator of German citizens. Next slide. I mentioned that 20% of the Ritchie boys were German and Austrian refugees. One of Camp Ritchie's secrets is that 600 Japanese Americans were also called to Ritchie, and that many of these came from the 10 internment camps scattered across the United States. This is another story, but I think we should remind ourselves that the United States also interned innocent citizens in the first years of the war. Fortunately, though, without the brutalization the German internees endured. Next slide. When the servicemen came to Ritchie, they were put through a rigorous 8-week training program. The camp commander, Charles Banfield, was determined that the training program be a completely immersive one, and that the soldiers should experience as close to a real-life war experience as possible. A corps of well over 400 Army men trained in the art of German and Japanese warfare provided a realistic environment for the trainees. I should say, in addition to the soldiers in uniform, Banfield also liked to have bombing raids of the camp. He was a pilot, and he would fly in his Piper Cub over the camp, dropping 5-pound bags of flour. And the men would have to run for cover, and if any of them got hit, they would get a demerit. So he was rather extreme in his training. For the Germans and Americans who'd fled the Nazis, it was a shock to come to this camp and see dozens of apparently German soldiers of all ranks, and to be confronted by all the weaponry and techniques of German warfare. German troops were constantly marching through the camp singing Nazi songs. One Jewish refugee from Austria remarked that he not only heard familiar Nazi songs, but he learned new ones from these marching soldiers at the camp. These German reenactors staged Nazi rallies, they demonstrated German firepower, and they mounted staged attacks. They were involved in many of the Ritchie Boys field exercises. And many of these exercises that the Ritchie Boys took part in occurred at night. In one, for example, students were sent out into the mountains at night with a flashlight, compass, and an area map written in an unknown language. And they had to find their way back to the camp, often while under attack by soldiers dressed in German uniform. Next slide. There were 3 specialties offered at the main camp. By far the largest specialization was interrogation. Here students learned how to psych out a prisoner for the best way to crack him and glean information from him. Ritchie actors in German uniform assumed the roles of different types of prisoners to give the students practice in questioning persons of different personality types, dialects, and political attitudes. In this training, the Ritchie Boys were trained to think creatively, but never to use violence. In fact, they were encouraged never to lay hands upon prisoner. Photo analysis was also a specialty at the camp. The men worked with a stereoscope viewer to create 3-dimensional images from photos placed side to side. They acquired the ability to study length of shadows and heights of hills so that they could tell whether a man standing at one point in a picture could see a man standing in another. Most importantly, they learned to discern camouflaged weaponry such as tanks. Later in the course, these men had to train their eyes so that they could look at photographs and force their eyes to create 3-dimensional images without benefit of a viewer. Needless to say, these men had to go through eye therapy at the end of the class. The smallest, most select group specialized in order of battle. The men in this specialty had to memorize, in addition to enemy ranks, uniforms, and weaponry, the names of all the German fighting units, their leaders, and their histories. They had to go through enemy materials and learn to evaluate it. Everything from official reports to personal letters, newspaper articles, enemy orders, and so on, and to glean information from them regarding the composition and strength of every German fighting unit in Europe. Finally, they learned how to organize these materials and to write updated studies based upon them. These were used in the field, both by the unit commanders and by the interrogators. And it was a great help to them to know what kind of unit they were facing and what the history of that unit had been. For instance, if they learned that a unit had recently come to Italy from Russia, where they had lost a lot of men, they could be fairly confident that the morale of these fighting troops was relatively low and they might be persuaded to surrender. In addition to these 3 specialties, 2 were added later. One was in psychological warfare at a sub-camp called Camp Sharp in Gettysburg, and one in counterintelligence when all counterintelligence training was brought to the camp. Next slide. Naturally, Ritchie Boys, like regular soldiers, were captured and made prisoners of war because Ritchie Boys were assigned to every fighting unit in Europe. And here are the names of the men that I've been able to find who were captured and sent to German prisoner war camps. For those that don't know, Stalag means basic or main camp, and Oflag means officers camp. The last one there, Oflag 64, was absolutely unique since it was a camp solely for captured American officers. The men housed here had been captured in France. Gary Baum, for example, flew into France by glider on the eve of D-Day. The glider crashed, he was badly wounded, and immediately taken prisoner. Next slide. There was only one Ritchie boy who was captured by the Germans and sent to a concentration camp rather than to a prisoner of war camp. And rather surprisingly, he was not a German or Austrian, but rather a Frenchman. Émile Minerault was born and grew up in Tours, France, emigrated to the States in 1936, and was drafted in 1942 and sent to Camp Ritchie to be trained as a French interrogator. But when he left Ritchie, he began doing undercover work in France by serving as the American member and second in command of a small British unit of the SOE, or Special Operations Executive. This unit operated a sea escape and entry route to France. In their runs between England and the coast of Brittany, Minerault and his men used small boats outfitted in such a way that they looked like small fishing craft. They were able to carry only about 6 men at a time, including crew. But in the winter and spring of 43-44, they were able to ferry 70 agents and downed airmen across the channel. And I recently learned that one of the agents that he ferried across was the French President, François Mitterrand. Although not a single passenger was lost in these transports, the British officers declared that the sea escape route was too dangerous to be used any longer, and Minerault then became part of a 3-man team responsible for transforming the operation into a land route over the Pyrenees. Here too, the team was successful and the land route functioned successfully right up until the French liberation. But Minerault was not so lucky. In April 1944, while he was in Paris, he fell into a Nazi trap and was captured by the Gestapo, tortured, and taken to Buchenwald. After 9 months in Buchenwald, he was transferred to the subcamp of Dora Mittelbau, described by all who knew it as by far the worst of the German work camps. Here, prisoners were forced to work on the German V-1 and V-2 rockets, designed by SS Major Werner von Braun and his team of German scientists. The prisoners worked 14-hour days in dark, unventilated tunnels where there was very little sanitation and inadequate food. It was not a death camp, but the conditions were such that 1/3 of all the prisoners brought to Dora died. Minerault was one of these. He died there on March 4th, 1945. 5 weeks later, on April 11th, Dora was liberated by the Americans. Ironically, the Americans liberated Buchenwald that same day. Next slide. For the German and Austrian Ritchie boys, entering the German camps was an excruciating experience. Nearly all of them had relatives who had been taken to these camps, and the majority of them had died there. Ernst Kramer remarked that conditions at Buchenwald were much worse than they'd been when he was imprisoned there. When one Ritchie lieutenant, Albert Rosenberg, entered Buchenwald with his team of 4 interrogators, he went to Buchenwald's little camp where evacuees from Auschwitz were being housed. Seeing that the emaciated survivors were not even aware that they had been liberated, he cut out a cardboard Jewish star, pinned it to his uniform, then mounted a chair and addressed the men in Yiddish, telling them that they were free. His driver was so horrified by what he saw in the little camp that he committed suicide. Another Ritchie boy, Cy Levin, had a nervous collapse when he saw the Buchenwald crematorium. He had to be declared a war casualty and sent back to the States for treatment. Rosenberg himself knew that his family members had been sent to the camp at Bergen-Belsen. He went there as soon as the British liberated the camp and drove through it, shouting by megaphone if there was anyone from the town of Göttingen in the camp named Rosenberg. No one answered. Rosenberg lost 26 family members in the camps. Next slide. Generals Patton and Eisenhower insisted that the conditions at the camps be documented immediately so that no one could deny what had occurred there. Ritchie Boy Bert Anger took photos at the Buchenwald subcamp of Tekla. Here, as Americans approached the camp, prison guards had forced 325 prisoners into a single barracks, locked and blockaded the doors and windows, and then fired incendiary grenades, into it. Anyone who managed to get out of the flaming building was then killed by machine gun fire. Bert Anger and his unit partner, Otto Scherpler, arrived at the camp just 2 hours after this horror occurred. And while Scherpler wrote up a report of the hell that they found there, Anger took photos to document the crime scene. Buchenwald was horrible, Scherpler told me. Tekla was savage. At Buchenwald, Albert Rosenberg gave tours of the camp to the German citizens of the nearby town of Weimar. By order of the Supreme Command, similar tours were given to the Germans who had lived near the other camps, and they were also ordered, in many cases, to assist in digging graves for the dead. Next slide. Albert Rosenberg and his Ritchie team were also charged with making a complete and thorough investigation of Buchenwald and writing it up as an official Army report. This study was to include how the camp developed, how it was structured, and how it was run. The liberated prisoners of the camp were interviewed by Rosenberg and his team, and they were all held at the camp until these interviews could take place. Meantime, Rosenberg selected a representative cadre of former prisoners to write a history of the camp. This full report, history and structure background, was used the following year at the Nuremberg trials. Next slide. Okay, I'd like to jump ahead now and show what the Germans have done to mark the horrors committed by their parents and their grandparents. 1970 marked a happy turning point in German history when Willy Brandt replaced Kurt Georg Kiesinger as West German Chancellor. Kiesinger had been a member of the Nazi Party. Brandt had been in the early resistance movement and had been forced to flee to Sweden for the duration of the war. In December 1970, Brandt, as the new chancellor, paid an emotional trip to Poland, where he spontaneously dropped to his knees in front of the monument to the heroes of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. With this startling gesture, Brandt demonstrated Germany's need to remember and to atone for the sins of its past. Since then, Germany has done its best to remember and memorialize the victims of the Nazi regime. In 1992, Stolpersteine, or stumbling stones, were introduced throughout Germany as memorials to the individuals who perished in the Holocaust. These are brass plates about 4 inches square that are affixed to cobblestones and paving stones and installed in the walkway to the last known private residence of Holocaust victims. Each stone gives a brief history of the victim honored by the stone, including deportation dates, imprisonments, and deaths, which they call murders. You see here the 3 stones placed before Hans Herzberg's family home for his father, mother, and younger brother. Herzberg, who had been so cruelly treated in the concentration camp in Sachsenhausen, lived to see these stones placed before his childhood home, and he became an active participant in numerous ceremonies honoring the victims of the Holocaust. Can we get that slide back? Thank you. To the right here, you can see how in 1973, the citizens of Göttingen, Albert Rosenberg's old hometown, memorialized the site of the city's old synagogue. From the outside, this memorial resembles a funeral pyre, while when one steps beneath it to look to the top, one sees a Jewish star. In 1995, Rosenberg was invited back to Göttingen to speak to a younger generation about the life of Göttingen's old Jewish community prior to Hitler's rise to power. Ernst Kramer, who had endured the horrors of imprisonment in Buchenwald in 1938, broke with most of the immigrant Ritchie boys by deciding to return to live in Germany after the war. He did so because he acknowledged his own duality. He was, as he emphasized, both a German and a Jew. He became a prominent journalist and devoted the rest of his life both to encouraging democratic processes in Germany and to trying to promote good relations between Germany, the United States, and Israel. He was the recipient of numerous honors and recognition of his being both a witness to a century of German history and a voice of tolerance. This is actually the end of my presentation, but I would only add that when Hitler came to power in 1933, there were 522,000 Jews living in Germany. At the end of the war, there were only 20,000 left. Today, there are just 118,000 Jews living in Germany. But on a positive note, Germany has the fastest growing Jewish population in Western Europe. And I take this as a good sign, despite a minority of neo-Nazi voices and anti-Semitic slurs that are still heard there as they are around the world. Thank you. I'll take questions now. There are some people here that are probably as knowledgeable about aspects of the camp as I am. So if I don't answer a question adequately, I hope they will jump in.
We have one question from Deborah Glazer. My friend's father was a German Jewish refugee and a Ritchie boy. She didn't know this until after he passed away because the info was still classified. Can she get in touch with the author to see if he has any info about him or people in his group? Thank you. So how would you advise people to research their own families or other Ritchie boys?
Well, if they want to know whether their father or uncle or whatever was a Ritchie boy, I have the full list of that, as well as the ones who came there in counterintelligence or Marines and so on. So I can help out there. I can tell what class they were in, what they specialized in, and if the information is when they were alerted to be sent abroad. I'll give my email address. Maybe that would be best. It is Eddy B, so my last name would be, at dickinson.edu, so for Dickinson College.
Okay, and we can send out a follow-up email to everyone who registered with any information we would like to include about research. And we've got a question. What is the title of Dr. Eddy's book? You want to just say the title? And we have it here in the museum store, but other ways for people to get the book?
Well, it's called Ritchie Boy Secrets, and it's available Barnes & Noble or Amazon or local bookstores.
From Chaplain Hockman, is there a list of units that they were attached to?
A list of units that they were attached to. Yeah, my partner, Dan Gross, who calls himself a Ritchie Boy wannabe, has collected tons and tons of information on this. And for he has individual timelines for over 600 of the Ritchie boys. He also has lists of the different teams and in many cases where they were attached. I don't want to bother him with thousands of inquiries. So if you want to send them to me, I can send on what I think he can answer.
Okay. From Paul Newman, are you familiar with the similar unit called X Troop in England? And I would just refer people to the talk Leah Garrett gave for us about her book on X Troop. You can check it out on our YouTube channel, and a very interesting book. So if you want to comment on X Troop.
Yes, that is a wonderful book. And it just shows the completely different way that the British used the German Americans, the German refugees from the Americans, because the Brits put these refugee Germans into internment camps when the war broke out, much as we did with the Japanese. And then they got this commando unit together. I believe it was 80 commandos that did very, very dangerous assignments. But when you consider that this was a commando group of 80 German exiles, and we're talking from Ritchie over 2,000, I think Americans use their German refugees in a better way.
We have a comment from Landon Grove about the museum they're forming, and let me see if I can get Landon up to talk about this himself. And this is a surprise to Landon. We didn't talk about this. Let me see if we can get him up here to tell folks about what's going on at Camp Ritchie Museum that they're developing. Let me see. Landon, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I thought maybe you'd like the opportunity to talk about it.
No, is my camera on?
It's not. We hear you. We don't see you.
All right, hang on.
There we go.
Okay. Hi, so I'm Landon Grove. We're forming a museum to honor the Ritchie boys at the former Camp Ritchie. Camp Ritchie, formerly Camp Ritchie in Fort Ritchie, was purchased in April, and the new owner has provided 2 full-scale mess halls for the purpose of an educational center, an archive, and a museum. So we've been collecting artifacts. We've been giving tours to the children of Ritchie boys, and it's been a really wonderful experience so far. And I just wanted to bring that to the attention of folks as well.
Yeah, thanks for being on, and everybody. We'll try to keep you updated on the progress of the Camp Ritchie Museum.
Right.
Thanks, Landon. I got a question, Dr. Eddy. We've heard a lot of similar stories about men that ended up in the OSS or other intelligence gathering roles. What was the relationship between the Military Intelligence Training Center, Camp Ritchie, and OSS or other intelligence positions in the military?
Well, actually, there was an OSS camp that was about 7 miles away from Camp Ritchie, and they shared instructors. For instance, William Fairbairn and Rex Applegate taught close combat fighting, both at OSS and at Camp Ritchie. So there was that there. There were the OSS men would come to the Camp Ritchie rifle range, for instance, instead of repeating rifle range at that OSS camp. And then, of course, a lot of the Ritchie boys, when they finished at Camp Ritchie, were invited to join the OSS and did. And they're the ones that, in many cases, went behind the lines. Minerault is a good example of that, the Frenchman who died at Dora. The interesting thing that I found is that you hear about these people were trained in interrogation, and you get the idea that that's all they did over there. Frequently, their assignments would change drastically between when they completed their training at Ritchie and when they got abroad. And so this is a fascinating aspect of it too. Some became tank commanders, some parachuted and behind the front lines on the eve of D-Day. There was photo and air intelligence flights that were taking place, all sorts of things. It's a tremendous variety of activities that they were involved in.
We have a question about the Ritchie girls. Can you address the wax at Camp Ritchie?
Yeah, I can. That was one of my surprises. I wasn't that surprised that there'd be wax there because obviously you want talented women who can take over the jobs of the men when they go abroad. But what did surprise me was that these wax had exactly the same backgrounds as the Ritchie boys. A lot of them were European Jews. They came to the camp. Some of them took courses with the men, especially in order of battle, because that was behind the lines non-fighting and they could be involved there. One of them, for instance, was served as President Eisenhower's Polish translator and was awarded the Bronze Star. She was a Polish Jew. And another one, a German Jew, widow, served as a lead translator at the concentration camp trials that were held in Dachau. The most amazing one to me is Ruth Mills Bradley, who was brought in actually as the commander of the wax at Ritchie. And then she was assigned to take 900 wax under her command to New Guinea and the Philippines and to work there. And they did admirable work there. So they were in their way as adventurous as the men were. 50 of the wax actually served as instructors. Some of them served as people that the interrogators had to practice interrogating. And so they were very much involved and intertwined with all the activities of the camp.
We have what was the highest rank achieved by a Ritchie boy during the war?
Oh boy. I can't go above lieutenant colonel in my mind, but there may be, that's the highest I can think of off the top of my head.
There was also not ranked, but there was a Medal of Honor recipient who if I recall correctly,
Yes.
was a Mormon from Idaho.
Yes, Leonard Broston. Yes, yes. Yeah, he was a Marine who had come to Ritchie to study and then went to the Pacific. And he was the one who got the Medal of Honor. Yeah.
We had a couple general questions. We are recording this and we will have this up on the museum YouTube channel, provided everything technologically worked out. And so we will send that out to everyone who registered as well. A lot of folks in the chat talking about their family members who were Ritchie boys. So it's always good to see that.
If any of them were captured, I want to know. I'm studying prisoner of war camps. I do not take them if they were immediately retaken from the camps. You know, if they were less than 5 days in a camp, I'm not interested. But if you have an ancestor who was in one of the camps and was not on the list that I showed, I'd appreciate hearing about it.
Okay, so we'll try to pass those along if we come across any. Marcy Waldstreicher asks, are there any Ritchie boys whose name we would recognize from later achievements?
Oh, yes. John Chafee, for instance, who was governor of Rhode Island and then Secretary of the Navy. Senator Frank Church of Idaho. This is just off the top of my head now. David Rockefeller, the banker. Let's see, actor Peter Van Eyck, who always played the quintessential Nazi officer, although he was an American officer interviewing Nazis during the war. J.D. Salinger. One of the Ritchie boys I talked to was housed in the same barracks with J.D. Salinger, and he said in his off hours, J.D. Salinger was always scribbling away on what he assumed must have been early versions of Catcher in the Rye. There was a Disney animator Tony Strobel, who worked on Fantasia and Dumbo and Pinocchio. And he was the one who did the illustrations, the drawings, and the layouts for the propaganda sheets that were fired into the front lines. You had the gossip columnist, Igor Cassini. Oh, wow. There's just so many, and in so many fields. Dean Brellis, the journalist and novelist. William Warfield, the opera star, went through the 5th class, I believe, at Ritchie. Yeah, there's lots.
I'm pretty sure this is incorrect, but I remember being told that Paul Robeson had an association with Camp Ritchie. Do you know? Does that come from something? Is there any origin story to that myth?
No, and there's a lot of myths. There's the even stronger myth is that Henry Kissinger was at Ritchie.
Well, he fit the profile and was kind of pulled into intelligence work, was not trained in that way.
So five Ritchie boys insist that they saw him there. And one Ritchie boy even insisted that he got him his promotion. So, and he wasn't. He said that he wasn't. So there's a lot of, was he a Ritchie boy? Just because you're a German immigrant to the United States and you got into the Army does not mean you went to Camp Ritchie. There are lots and lots of infantrymen that were German soldiers, German-American soldiers, excuse me.
Deborah Glazer asked about Victor Bromberg, a professor of French at Yale. Any interesting info about him?
Well, he was certainly one who's still very much alive and active and talking about it. He was on the 60-minute program, an interrogator. He has a very interesting story that I think that after the war, the Ritchie boys stayed there as interrogators for denazification purposes. They were supposed to weed out the Nazi members, the former SS officers and such. And Bromberg said that, yes, they did that very conscientiously. And what happened was the American military would immediately take these men, say thank you, and then give them positions in the new government because they needed men with experience. And of course, the men with experience had probably been members of the Nazi Party. And there was quite a bit of bitterness among many of the Ritchie boys that instead of concentrating on denazification at the end of the war, America immediately jumped into the Cold War.
All right, I think that brings us to the end of the question. So let everybody know the book is Ritchie Boy Secrets by Dr. Beverley Eddy. And it should be, we'll send out links on where to get the book and for more information, and we can include about the Camp Ritchie Museum where Landon's project is working on. So hopefully that'll be available to visit soon. And thanks to everyone for being on.